Welcome to the CX Files. Today's guest is Mark Muston. He leads strategic initiatives at Modern Health, a global mental health care platform working primarily with employers. He's been at Modern Health for 5 years and previously has led multiple functions across provider operations and global expansion. Prior to Modern Health, he spent 8 years at Citigroup as a commodities trader, responsible for building out and growing global trading businesses while based in New York, London, and Singapore. Mark, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Ben. I'm excited for today.
Yeah, this is fun. So one of the things I like to ask right from the beginning is, when you started your career, what's one of the first things that you learned about customer experience, good or bad?
Yeah, definitely. So I think I started my career not the traditional health tech start and on a trading floor in New York, coming out of, going to school on the East Coast. And, that was really where a lot of like folks I looked up to during my time had gone. And so spent some time there as a trader of a few things. But my first year was trading bonds out of the New York office. And I think on the customer experience side at that time, I was fortunate enough to work for Citibank and they were like far and away the leader in that space. And so it was really interesting for your first job to be someone who was 2 to 3x bigger in terms of market share than the number two or number three player, and to really learn like what that level of success could look like. And I think certainly an intimidating atmosphere of any first job is to be on an old school trading floor where there was very much yelling and cursing and all of those fun things. But what really stuck out to me was the relationships and the sales folks who did really well in that environment, or the traders who did really well in that environment, had built this level of trust and like authenticity with their clients. And so it was less about kind of always doing what made them happy. It was about building this like deep level of trust. And I think it took me a little bit to kind of notice what was going on. And it was less of what I thought customer experience would be, of this kind of customer's always right, make them always happy, always tell them that they look great and they're having a great day. And this kind of like blind optimism or toxic positivity. It was much more of these like authentic relationships. And as I, spent that year there and got to know some of our key clients and would go out and to do events and all these things, it was realizing the value of building authenticity and the value of almost imperfection, in a sense of being able to be a trusted partner, and not always, and being able to have that relationship allowed our team to continue to kind of really own that space, whether we made mistakes or not, as we thought about it. So I think that was really, really impactful and really changed my perspective around what it meant to do customer experience or customer service, and really what kind of what it was and what it wasn't when, in a world that clearly was working so well.
Yeah, I mean, and that's such a great lesson too. I think, it's so easy to go into an interaction and just say, okay, I'm going to put my smile on, you know, the world is falling, it's a disaster, we're losing a ton of money, and I'm just going to pretend that it's all, puppy dogs and ice cream, or whatever. But I think showing authenticity is always so important for building trust, and ultimately, that feeds into everything else that we're trying to achieve. So, I think that toxic positivity is definitely a trap that people can fall into. But once you've established, yeah, okay, I made a mistake, or I really, this is really a big challenge. We have to face this. That opens people up to trusting each other. So that can really be helpful. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I want to ask a little bit about something you've been working on recently as well. So, we kind of talked about the beginning of your career. What have you been up to, maybe in the last year or so?
Yeah, definitely. So in my current role, I lead strategic operations, or strategic initiatives rather, where I think, as you mentioned earlier, we're a global mental health benefit company working primarily with employers of all sizes and locations. And so in the last 2 years, one of the core projects myself and the team have led is around bringing like a new package or a new product offering to market. And so in that, it's actually a product that we support both in-house and through a service partner. And so that's something we've been, really focused on recently. It's been really fun to see that, really challenging to see that, but also really fun to see us, really have like a high growth new product come to market, have that really resonate with clients and grow. And I think kind of around like that's been something fun. And to your question of, like what that's really been, what I've been focused on in that, I think is really learning this balance of how do you get folks excited around a product? How do you roadmap it correctly? And then how do you deliver to meet those expectations? And I think it's such a challenge of, anyone who's worked in like a B2B environment, and I spend a lot of my time on external client calls, is, sales wants to sell the world, client success wants to undersell the world. And, you're sitting in the middle working with all parties trying to figure out how do we actually get a successful product to market. And so I think that's been a really fun, opportunity, and it leaned on some of my experience at Citi, but really trying to find that balance, knowing when it was time to ship and when we could, and how we fix those things along the way. And how do we build trust with clients who got that product day one, or, we're now in our second year of that offering. And how do we kind of show that continue to grow and show that value to continue to accumulate to those clients?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that a previous guest pointed out very wisely, I had a guy on called David Riceley, and he's talking about how employee experience impacts customer experience, right? So how is your team feeling? How is your team operating? If your team's being treated well, then of course that's gonna have a ripple effect, and customers are gonna feel that on some level. How do you think about that?
Yeah, it's such an interesting observation. I hugely, hugely agree. And so my current role is much more about kind of be a lean team leading cross-functional projects. In my past life at Modern Health, early on, I led like our provider network build out in that team, and so we were, was managing through that. One of the teams I managed was our like therapist recruiting or coach recruiting teams, and I think that one, more pertinent to that direct kind of like customer experience of our providers for Modern Health as like a multi-sided marketplace. It was really interesting of, how do you intrinsically build like morale and build motivation for your team and build support for your team? And I think one of the things that always stuck out to me in a very tangible way from that experience is the motivation of the team members, would outperform like the system or the tooling or the efficiency work you were doing, and the recruiter who like felt supported by their manager really believed in the mission, believed what they were doing was exciting and impactful. They were outperforming their quota by 30, 40, 50%. And that team member who didn't feel supported and it didn't feel bought into that mission, just wasn't motivated beyond kind of the general, this is a salary for quota, they were barely hitting quota or they were falling under. And so I think in that sense, it was fun to see that in such a visual, tangible way, like thinking about a recruiting team in that moment. And it really, it shaped my style of leadership and shaped the way I thought about those experiences of we're such like creatures of groups, and we believe and like we want to support each other, we want to help each other, we want to serve this higher purpose. And so if you can create an environment and truly believe that you're creating that and you're creating, like that what your team works on is, you can help them see how it's aligned to the business and the vision and the mission. And if you can support them in that way, it was really impressive to see, those folks who did buy in, just massively outperform regardless of their salary or bonus or whatever it might have been to motivate them.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that leads me into the next question here. I think there's so many things in business where it comes down to, what are the numbers? What's the data? Um, what's our profit going to be on this new initiative? What's our time to return our investment and so on. Um, but then as you're telling the story, I mean, it's just so obvious that human intuition, excuse me, and human motivation is so important. So, how do you kind of balance kind of data with emotion, so to speak?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. I think I was reflecting on this of, working with a variety of different personality types across the Modern Health leadership team and previously working at Citi. There's a little bit of like what the company culture is. Like some company cultures, whether departmental or at the, the exec level, there's one of a more uniform or non-uniform culture of we're a data-driven organization, or we're a, go with your gut, almost like Apple style, one big launch a year and just like, create this emotional reaction, or we're an iterative, follow the data trail and go from there. And so I think part of it is kind of understanding not only like your own style of operating, and for over myself, kind of where do I lean in, lean out, and how do I think about that, but also understanding the environment you're operating in. And, you know, if you have a strong gut feel, do you have a manager? Do you have cross-functional resources that are going to, they're going to lean into that and say, hey, you've done great work. We trust you. We'll go with your gut. Let's do it. Or do you live in an organization where it's, no data, no deal. And if you can't back it up with numbers, like you're dead in the water, and there's, regardless of how you're feeling. So I think it's important to acknowledge the environment you're in. I think for my personal self of where do I get conviction and how do I feel like I have what I need, I kind of view them as like a weighted average, or not necessarily weighted average, but like a combination score of both, like how strong the data is and how convicted I am in like that data being accurate and representative. And then also, what is my gut telling me and how strongly is it telling me that? So in a simple sense of like, if they're both on a 1 to 10 point scale, you're adding those up. And if it's, if it's a 10 out of 10 on both of those, no brainer, you want to push for that. But I've also found moments where if my intuition's extremely strong and this is, hey, this is just, I feel very much that this is what our customers want, or this is a gap they need. We don't collect data in a way that really shows that, but I believe that it's there from intuition and logic. Then I will push for that if it's like a 10 out of 10 on that intuition side. Or oftentimes you kind of find you have some data, but it's not the most helpful, and you balance that with some intuition, but not the strongest. So I sort of think about those as kind of add them both up. And if the sum score is above this magic threshold, like that's kind of, that's your mind telling you you should push for that. But again, I think I sort of treat it as two things. One is like, do I think we should do this? And then second is, how do I sell the business on doing this? And that selling the business definitely comes down to what's like the interaction norms of that organization? Is it data? Is it intuition? Is it both?
Definitely. Yeah, I think this is the kind of the really the old joke about business is that, if you try to teach it, you get a lot of like, well, it depends,
Yeah,
kind of
so true.
answers. Um, but yeah, one of the points here that I've been thinking about is, we believe that CX is foundational to business success. We, as in myself and the audience here,
Hmm.
and I think that awareness is growing over time within organizations. But leadership doesn't always come from that same kind of understanding. So how do you think about connecting, the CX goals that do we know drive business metrics, but how do you connect that with leadership so they, maybe are more willing to support an initiative or get behind a project?
Definitely. Yeah, I think I've done this a little bit in more of like an operations role, and then now there's more this more project management role. I think one thing I always say to like folks on the team I've managed, and I've certainly learned repeatedly throughout my career, is like sales is not a department. Sales is a part of every person's job. And I think that's like a really important thing to instill, or if you're in these roles of trying to get a project off the ground or trying to get resourcing for a thing, you're a salesperson. You might be selling your CFO, you might be selling the head of ops, you might be selling your direct boss, but you're selling. And I think that's a really important thing of um, just acknowledging that. And some folks have their own feelings if they want to be a salesperson or not. But I think that is a really important component of it is like, how do we, how do you just acknowledge that to get this to happen, you need people to feel the way you feel and get excited the way you're excited and believe what you believe. And that there's a journey to that. And then the other one, I think, so one is like, you think about this lens, and I've done this in the past of like, they look very similar to like a client facing deck. Like I literally just do a sales pitch to an executive or manager or coworker or whatever it is. But then the second one is this common language idea. So like, what do you put in that deck or that pitch or that speech you're going to give? And I think that's a really important one of oftentimes where I see this gap in the business is you have one team who has this very strong belief of like, we have the saying at Modern Health of like the best provider experience is the best member experience. So Modern Health, in a very simple thing, one of the things we do, we connect our members to therapists and coaches globally. And so we very much believe that if you treat that provider the best you can, you offer them a wonderful experience, you pay them on time, you make their life easy, you remove the admin, they're going to not only will they have more time to care for your members, they're going to have more energy, more motivation, and just more passion to care for your members. Sort of about that idea earlier of like getting folks bought in, and they'll do their best work beyond just what the compensation would imply. And so that mantra of like the best provider experience is the best member experience is a great rallying cry for like a provider support team. But it's really important to find like what's the common language for the business and what's the metric that shows that. And so in that example, it might be member NPS. And if we can say, hey, like clients are more likely to renew with us if they have a member NPS of X or higher, and member NPS is like heavily influenced by their experience in session with that provider. If you can connect those dots, you now have a common language. And so it might not be what you started with, which is you really want provider NPS to go up, but you've now connected the dots between where does a business want to invest, what do they want to see, and where do you really feel like there's an opportunity to have a great experience. And now you kind of have that metric of, okay, it's, takes you 2 or 3 steps, but you can really invest in this, do this thing, show that it leads to better NPS, better client retention, and now you've gotten, you've got everyone on board with your vision. And so I think that common language idea is really important. In that example, it was fairly straightforward to map that. Some of these are much harder, but I think it's really important to think through, like, how can I get us to a metric that everyone's going to care about, that is ideally, if not correlated, ideally causated by kind of what you directly want to drive.
Yeah, I think that that's such a great insight, and I think, understanding the language of the person that you're talking to, understanding the specific phrases or metrics, the specific things that they really care about, and then being able to connect back to that and say, hey, do you want this? Here's how we get you this, right? Um, yeah, that's a great point about the common language of the business.
It's almost,
Um,
sorry to cut
Go
in,
ahead.
like your comment of like, yeah, you almost do like a discovery call. I don't know, like I know the sales world, just from being a large part of that throughout the years, like you're almost doing like a discovery call with your own internal coworker, manager, or whatever, of like, what do you care about? What are you trying to solve? And then how can I connect my solution to your needs? Again, not to overuse the sales analogy, but it's kind of funny how it sounds similar,
Absolutely. And I think that that's historically that's been one of the challenges for customer facing teams
Mhm.
is, there's for better or worse, well, mostly for worse, there's this image of, the customer facing team as being this kind of underdog,
Yeah.
kind of run to the litter kind of image.
Cost center.
And it's hard for them to sell internally because they're, kind of been looked down upon as like, not that important compared to sales itself or, maybe product engineering or something like that, right? Um, but I think that that role is changing and that kind of underdog status, it can actually, it can be quite powerful. It can be a way to garner more support actually if you kind of flip it. You almost need to do like a judo move and say like, look, counter to expectation, there's a ton of value here that you can unlock for the business. And then that skill that you're talking about of selling internally, I think is so relevant, especially given that that kind of legacy image of customer facing work. Um, so it's absolutely relevant, and I think that's great for people in the audience to learn these kind of skills, whether they're interested in sales or not. It's essential.
Well said.
Um, So yeah, one of the things I wanted to ask you about is this challenge of serving different types of customers
Mm.
because Modern Health is a marketplace business. We've talked to leaders in other marketplace businesses. Helpfeel itself has customers that are marketplace businesses, and these are particularly challenging businesses for customer service and customer success and support because there's all these different needs. It's really a diverse group of people. Um, how do you approach the challenge of serving all these different needs?
Yeah, it's a great call out. I think, for those who are familiar with health tech or benefit space, this will be a refresher for you. But for those who aren't, so one of the primary go-to-market channels we have is through employers. And so how that process typically works, the employer works with a consultant, and these be companies like Willis Towers Watson, Mercer, Alliant, Ion, and more. And their job is to consult the employer on what benefits would help them, kind of guide them through that process, be an expert, almost like a wealth manager would with your finances, or a consultant would for your business. And so they really, as consultants, they really do consult on benefits. And so what's interesting is you have this environment where, Modern Health builds a product, and then we educate our sales team on how to sell that product. That sales team goes and talks to a consultant and says, hey, here's what's going on with our product. Do you have clients? Do you have employers who'd be interested? They say yes. Then they talk to the employers, and then the employer buys that product and their employees use it. So as you can imagine this visual, it's like, here's what we've built. It goes out, then to the consultant, then to the employer, then to the member. And so you've got like five core areas of, who's involved in this process. And so I think that's like a unique one of, the role of the consultant is, hugely helpful, very powerful, very logical, but also just creates this added complexity. And the role of the employer, being responsible in the US for health insurance and benefits, also adds this complexity of you're building what you think the employer thinks that their employees would want, or what the consultant thinks the employer thinks the employees would want. And so I think what's important in those moments is, and then internally, Modern Health, not to add complexity, is like we're a variety of things, but on the provider-based care side, we're a network of therapists and coaches and psychiatrists, medical managers, and then those work directly with members or with our, and then we have, so you have all these different connectivity points, like a provider working with a member or our client success team working with a client. And so you end up, and there's a lot of times where it's a very complicated situation. And so in those moments, I think it's really important to like acknowledge and try and where you can separate out, are we like, who are we building for and why, what needs are we trying to solve and why, and understanding, it's what do members really want to see? Does that align with what their employers want to see? And ideally, you're looking for those overlap of where do both parties really benefit. And so I think that's a really challenging environment. So I think first and foremost, it's important to acknowledge like how many voices are in this room. And I think sometimes folks oversimplify their business and they think it's, we have customers and we have our business. And, as an example I gave, there's four other folks in that room and they all deserve, a wonderful customer experience. And so I think it's like, as you acknowledge that, think through that. And then as you work with each of those groups, really, and this is like a tough one, but a great one for CX folks is putting yourself in their shoes and understanding the content, the context, and kind of the language they want to speak in. How we work with consultants very different than how we work with a prospect. How we communicate with our members or employers, employees very different than how we communicate with our providers. And so I think trying to customize to the degree you can for that audience and acknowledging their uniqueness can be really helpful. And I think it takes more time. You have to kind of slow down and say, hey, this communication doesn't work for all five of them. I have to tailor it to each. But what you'll find is in those moments, it can be really impactful of, hey, we feel heard. We feel like you really resonate with what we're looking for. We as employers, as consultants, as employees, or as therapists in that example.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it reminds me of this kind of UX activity of building customer personas.
Yeah.
I mean, it overlaps into sales and other realms as well. But I think of like if you have a clear understanding of not of just a kind of average customer, but of a few very specific types of customers, then everybody can kind of get on the same page and like having those conversations with these different groups, you can get some kind of consistency.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. I wanted to ask you a little bit. There's a kind of a challenge here that I see um, is slowly getting better, but basically the impact of customer experience on revenue is historically hard to track. And how do you think about just connecting the dots? You've got all these different groups of customers, you've got all these different activities going on, a lot of interactions from video calls to emails and everything. You probably have some kinds of workflows inside of your application or on your website. Yeah, how have you been thinking about this challenge, and if you have any examples?
Yeah, definitely. So to say it back, I think it's, how do you connect the value of customer experience into like business metrics or into like, roadmaps as we think forward?
Yeah,
Yeah, I think it's a challenge. I think kind of back to your comment of like data and intuition. If there's a data trail, you got to follow it, I think is really important. If there's not, and there's an intuition trail, I think you can also follow that. Ideally, you have both is, that works really well. If there's a logical reason that, happy employee equals happy employer for our scenario, or the earlier, like, happy provider equals happy member. Um, but I think, yeah, I think it comes back to that, as an engineer by training, it's like, this is a very nuanced reference, but anyone who's done like math and science, like you have, like trying to figure out your units and like canceling out your units in like high school algebra and math of like, okay, it's centimeters up top and centimeters over here later in the formula below. So those net out. So I do a lot of that kind of logic of how do we take the data we have and can we directly connect it to the data? Like, for any B2B SaaS company, it's like, revenue retention, kind of NDR, GDR, all that fun stuff, net new revenue or net new ARR. And so like, can we connect up into that? And rarely, to be frank, rarely can you connect it directly of like, a provider or whatever, a member giving us a 5-star rating leads to that employer renewing 10% more than someone else. Like it's hard to connect all that way, but I would encourage again of like, how can you connect into some of these themes and then, you let logic take you the rest of the way if needed. And so, for example, we might say a client that has, like has a certain level of engagement or a certain level of like positive reviews or a certain type of, certain percentage of folks who do a certain step, like that correlates to that client most likely staying. And then we can sort of connect the dot of, okay, what gives that, how does those client have like those reviews or those 5-star ratings, if you will? And it comes down to like, well, most of that experience stems from, the customer success agent, or sorry, the customer support agent. And so how do we, you can kind of connect into the team, but it's a really challenging one. I think the pros and cons of today's data world is, we joke at Modern Health, there's so much data we have, just because we've, been really thoughtful of how we built that. But sometimes it's hard to find like the actual, what's it actually telling you? And you can kind of get lost in that or come to the wrong conclusions in that if you're not careful. So I do think it's important to have that combination of, can you kind of map into the theme the best you can? And that idea of kind of like start with the data points you believe in and cancel your units up into the company metrics, but also acknowledging that, most of the time you don't get all the way there. But if you can at least get it into a theme of like, this is highly correlated with client retention, yes, that's a big enough theme that we care about. And so you can sort of give yourself that. And then what we've done for some projects is when you get that buy-in, then we actually agree on a way to track the data going forward. So we say, okay, we're going to invest in this project, we're going to do this thing, but let's see how much it does impact. So let's, put in place whatever data tracking we need, or let's record certain actions we take, and then we can follow up 6 months later and say, hey, this is working. Let's invest more. Let's continue to invest. So I think it's sort of that, use the tools you've got. If you can connect the data, if you can connect through logic, and then a lot of times if you can't get the conviction you want, almost treat it like a pilot and like, get your validation, through those first few months.
That makes sense, absolutely. And I think the more you invest in something, um, the higher your motivation should be to track its results, right?
Yeah, very true.
Um,
Yeah. At some point, people
yeah,
start
so
calling you when the investment's big enough.
right, right. Um, so we've talked about the past, we've talked about the present. I'd like to talk about the future a little bit. What are some things that you're excited about in the space that you're focused on here?
Yeah, definitely. There's some nuanced views I have around like health tech in that direction, but I think like thinking through, more of that kind of CX lens and teams I manage and roles I manage there. I do think, everyone has their own view on AI. I think what AI has been really, really powerful for in the like today or in the very short term is AI can really connect the dots that just take too much time to do manually. And so you can get this very personalized feel. And so, for example, I was like looking at, we use some like AI tools internally just to help us kind of navigate things. And one example was I was on a external call earlier this week, actually. And I just went into one of like our internal search LLMs and was like, hey, tell me everything that's been going on with this client. Has there been any like positive or negative reviews about this service? Has there any been concerns around this, recent upgrade they did or, new product they started using? And you just get this, within 5 minutes, it was like, this is what's been going on with this client. Obviously, it's relying on us. We use like Jira as a system. So it's relying on us tracking them. So, folks have to be diligent to the tools they have. But at Modern, luckily, we are. And so that was really cool. You get this very personalized experience that, no one has the bandwidth to do that manually. No one's going to, like, I love Slack. I'm not searching Slack to try and find every one of those, just it takes forever. And so I think that's a really cool ability to really make folks feel like personalized and unique and special in a scalable way. And I think
Mhm.
there's, the long arc is like chatbot AI only, but in the immediate term, whether with clients or with, end users or with providers, there is this like scalable way to still have a very human interaction, but to actually, to not miss anything. And I think that's really powerful and just kind of in like the shorter term.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I uh I love Slack, and the acronym is a searchable log of all communication and knowledge, I
Yeah.
believe. But the first word is searchable,
Yeah.
and unfortunately, the search in Slack is just not that great, is it?
Yeah, no, I think it's also, I think, we have a lot of folks have this issue. I think, there's some stat I was reading of the average company has like 400 or 500 software vendors. It's like some number that is orders of magnitude higher than you would think. And you're like, no, there's no way that's
Right.
right. And then I looked at my own and was like, okay, well, I used 30 in the last 24 hours. Seems fair. Um, and so, yeah, I do think it's Slack itself, to cut them some slack, if you will, is they're just one repository. It's like we use Google Suite, use Notion, and so I think that's where, additionally, like, these places that can really be aggregators or platforms are really powerful. That's just something we haven't scalably had access to before, is how do you kind of search across the entire knowledge base? And that we see that with, for individual customers as well. We can see, what they're engaging with in the product and all that stuff, and we can now aggregate that in. So the same way of, what I did for a client call, you could do for an individual who reached out, hey, I'm looking for a new coach. I'm thinking about this. We can pull in all their history of like where their sessions were, all that stuff. And you can do that in a fast enough time that you can scalably like personalize that service more than usual. So it's a super fun area.
Definitely.
Really curious to see where it all goes.
Yeah, definitely. I think the opportunities are immense. Probably goes without saying. I think that there's going to be, just a little bit of my own prediction here, but I think this year there's going to be a little bit of pullback on the optimism with AI
Yeah.
and a little bit more of like get back to the fundamentals, like where are the real results. I mean, there's been so much marketing hype, a lot of it justified, but some of it not. And I think the use cases where it's really effective, I think are going to start to be more obvious this year. Um, Chatbots are great, but it's all the things around that as well, right? Like you're kind of alluding to before, is you have to have diligence to use the tools and get the data in there accurately. The human element is just as important as ever, and also on the output, right? It's like how do you and this is, I guess a question for you is how do you think about getting quality output, like actionable steps, things that you can use to improve. A lot of the things in AI are kind of, it's a little bit of a black box. Yeah, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, for sure. AI specifically, or like AI kind of
Yeah,
tools
AI
specifically.
and just and chatbots and these kinds of tools where you put something in and some magic happens, and then like, well, how did we get that result?
Yeah. What is it's like? I think there's like the saying is any technology sufficiently advanced is indistinguishable from magic. I think is like the quote that
Yep.
comes to mind. Um,
Yep.
and as an engineer, my brain always kind of goes to this place of, the tools are wonderful, but at their core, they're just leveraging the data you provide them. And so I think important is, it's sort of like we had cars and we tried to have driverless cars, and we didn't really want to acknowledge there was this 10-year arc of adaptive cruise control that got us from cars to self-driving cars. And I think in a similar way, I agree with your comment of, I think some components of it are overhyped. And I think one, for example, is modern health. Like we're thinking about the role of AI tooling to supplement the care providers give. We don't personally, as a company, we don't believe that we're going to, in 2025, that we're going to put an AI chatbot in front of someone with a clinical need. That's important. That's not something we want to do. But thinking about how can that AI tool like supplement, and I think to your kind of to that theme and to that question is, I think the important part is, are you building these models intentionally with like data capture in the right way? And and a simple example is like, are you categorizing it? Are you making that data like usable, discernible? Early on when we were recruiting for our network, we had some free text response questions, and it's terrible. It takes you hours to get value out of, and they're like, why was this a free text response? It could have been a checkbox, and you just like
Hmm.
those kind of insights of how do you build like a data infrastructure that's usable, and then that's ultimately what feeds your model, and then your model gets more predictable, more routine kind of results, because it's got that like cleanness and consistency of data going in. So I think it's important there. And I also think, like kind of with the example of our clinical philosophy is, it's important to kind of draw clear lines, especially early on, of if you want your chatbot to do everything. I think we've all had this experience of like, here's an AI chatbot, we can help you with your flight. It just took you 4 more minutes to get a representative on the phone. Like the chatbot couldn't actually do, they kind of jumped to driverless car right away. And it's like, and I think that's, I don't know, I've had that experience recently with some airline issues. And, I think that's a representation of this overhyped or kind of belief that we're already there. And I think we get there, but I think the important thing is, are we being really intentional back to like kind of that user experiences? Are we being intentional of how we're using this? Um, and it can be really helpful and create this amazing, memorable experience if used the right way. Or it can make us feel like we have a slightly worse version of the chatbots that first came out in the 2000s, if we kind of jump to that finish line too quickly.
Absolutely. What a great way to put it. I think that's so true, and I think that you have to. you have to consider where it makes sense and where it doesn't make sense. Say, this would be nice to have, we must have this, or we're not going to have this,
Yeah.
right? Deciding the no's are almost as important as the yeses, right?
Yeah. Well said.
Um, yeah, so, well, what a great conversation. I really appreciate your perspective on this. To close out the episode here, I just want to ask you, do you have any tips or advice for people who are looking to advance their careers? Maybe some lessons that you've learned as I know you've switched roles and
Mhm.
focus areas. This could be specific to CX or just general career advice. Anything you want to share?
Yeah, for sure. I can give a couple. I think one not specific to kind of like CX and one specific to CX. I think the one not is, I my last job at Citi before I moved to Modern Health was trading iron ore and iron ore derivatives. If anyone doesn't know what iron ore and iron ore derivatives, that's okay. You're a normal person. You're not supposed to. It is literally dirt. It's what makes steel, the raw ingredient that becomes steel for all the things that we use, appliances and cars and all that fun stuff, buildings. And so coming from a world where I built a ton of supply demand models, worked with quants, worked with engineers, built out pricing tools, risk management tools, worked on like building new trading businesses kind of from 0 to 1 in New York and London and Singapore. Um, I came into this world of mental health tech in San Francisco, and I assumed I was hardworking, but I would probably benefit very little from anything that had got me there. And I think what I was surprised by pleasantly is, how much you are learning skills that apply in areas you wouldn't expect. And so, for example, early on at Modern Health, we were growing a global business, we are growing a global provider network. And it's no coincidence. I think one of the things we've, my biased opinion having been involved is I think we do an amazing job monitoring our network, recruiting a best in class network, and then making sure folks can get care anywhere in the world within 24 hours. And the reason we did that fundamentally different than everyone else is I literally took the fundamentals of iron ore supply demand models and like that were highly quantitative, and they had predictive forecasting, all this fun stuff. And we rebuilt those for therapists and coaches globally around, thinking about demographics, location, specialization, all these things. And so that was a really fun moment and really encouraging moment of anyone thinking about that career pivot or thinking about, switching departments or switching industries or switching, kind of job types. Just I encourage you to kind of have confidence in, if you're smart, hardworking, and you're pushing yourself each day, like, you are more set up for success than you probably realize in a role that may feel, at that initial JD may feel totally tangential to what you've been doing. I think there are just kind of like common themes that apply across businesses, industries, and the rest. So I think that was particularly, something I learned more recently that I hugely value and will carry with me as I go on to, future endeavors. And then the other one, I think more specific to customer experience, I think we've talked a lot about, understanding how to connect your story into the business. I think it's hugely important. That separates folks who are kind of more on that front line or newer in their career from the folks who really grow into becoming leaders is understanding like how you tie into the business. And I think part of that I would say is understanding when you're in the limelight and when you're not. And I think I've had a variety of those experiences in my career of sometimes the thing you're working on isn't a business priority. It doesn't mean you don't have to do it. It doesn't mean it doesn't matter, but that's not where the incremental investment is going to go or the incremental focus is going to be. And then sometimes it is. And I think having that patience and that understanding and kind of seeing the broader business, being able to acknowledge this, right now, this is not a priority for us to focus on this one area of my team that I personally care about, but is already going well, and we don't need it to make it's not a priority to make it go from like an A to an A plus product. Versus there's other times where when that is the thing where yeah, for better or for worse, like you're in the hot seat, understand that is your opportunity to kind of take those pitch those bigger projects and work for that. So I think having that ability to step back and see the whole business and understand how you fit into it can be really powerful. And I think that separates folks I've seen do really well is that ability to acknowledge, at that point in time, how important their specific concern or area is to the business and how they and by doing that, it helps them articulate it in a way that, you know, either gets them the piece they need of, okay, not now, but maybe next quarter or next half, or it gets them the buy-in they need of, you're right, this is important today, let's do it today.
All right. I think that's super helpful advice. Mark, thanks so much for coming on today, and we'll see you next time, everybody, on the CX Files. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, Ben.